Namaste. This clipping is on components of expenditure method of calculation of national income. So we will see how the various final expenditures are going to be aggregated to arrive at the GDP, MP or the gross domestic product at market price. So under the expenditure method, it is only the aggregation of final expenditures, that means the final expenditure undertaken by the various categories like the households, the firm, the government and the external sector in a four-sector economy will be aggregated under this particular method. So to begin with, we have the private final consumption expenditure or the PFCE. The private final consumption expenditure is expenditure that is undertaken by the households and the private not-for-profit organizations on the consumer products. So, on a regular basis, the consumer households, they spend on a variety of durables and semi-durables and non-durables, single-use commodities and services. This you are already aware of. So, such expenditure that is undertaken by the households and the private not-for-profit organizations will make up the PFCE or the private final consumption expenditure. To look into the finer aspects of the PFCE, it is expenditure of the normal residents. I repeat, it is expenditure of the normal residents on the final products which is included over here as PFCE. So, it would be the expenditure undertaken by the normal residents on domestic purchases. If the normal residents are going to go abroad and while they are touring or for any other purpose if they happen to go abroad, then the expenditure that they are going to undertake in the foreign land will also be treated as the final expenditure and it would be considered as part of PFCE. So as long as a normal resident is going to undertake the final expenditure for consumption purpose within the domestic territory or while in foreign travel, that would be considered as the private final consumption expenditure. So to repeat, the private final consumption expenditure is the final expenditure that is going to be undertaken by the households and the private not-for-profit organizations or the NGOs. That's the first component. The second major component is that of the government, the general government spending on variety of things for maintenance of their administrative departments. So to maintain law and order, to keep up peace, to promote internal peace and also protect the nation from external aggression. They run the defense department and then they have the police department and so on. So, for such departmental undertakings, whatever purchases they are going to make, it will come under this category. It will be considered as the intermediate consumption expenditure undertaken by the government. So, as final components of the government final consumption expenditure or the GFCE, the first is the intermediate consumption expenditure undertaken by the government for running of the various government departments. The second one is the COE or the compensation of employees to the government staff. The third component is the direct purchases or the import that the government is going to undertake from the rest of the world for running their embassies, consulates and such. So rather than calling it an import, it is to be called as a direct purchase only. Direct purchase done by the government in rest of the world for running of their embassies and consulates. So all these things, namely the intermediate consumption expenditure and then the COE of the government and then the direct purchases made by the government for the embassies and consulates, these three components have to be added up, and sale of goods and services undertaken by the government, the value of sale of goods and services undertaken by the government should be reduced finally to arrive at the GFCE. So to sum up GFCE, I repeat, the intermediate consumption of the government general plus the COE of the government plus the direct purchases made by the government for embassies and consulates minus sale of the goods and services of the government. So that would give the second major component of the expenditure method, namely the government final consumption expenditure. Then there is this domestic capital formation. It could be given as a gross domestic capital formation, or it could be given as a net domestic capital formation. It depends upon whether there is an allowance made for depreciation or not. Depending upon that particular concept, gross domestic capital formation or net domestic capital formation, you will arrive at either the NDP MP or the GDP MP. So this gross domestic capital formation of the economy, it can be broken up into two components, the fixed capital formation and the inventory capital. So the fixed capital, it can be undertaken again by the three parties, namely the households, the firms and then the government. So the households, they spend on residential construction. So building of the house or their residence, it comes under the asset formation or the fixed capital formation for the households because it's a major expenditure. It is not considered as PFCE. PFCE will include all the purchases that is made by the households, namely the durables, semi-durables, non-durables and single-use commodities and so on. So leaving out the residential construction, all other consumables will be the private final consumption expenditure. Only the household residential construction will be treated as part of gross domestic capital formation or fixed capital formation. Firms, what about firms? Firms also undertake fixed investments on machinery and installations and so on. So for the production purpose, whatever fixed assets they are going to buy, it comes under the domestic capital formation. Government also on a regular basis, they invest huge sums of money on construction, building, land acquisition and so on. So construction of a flyover, construction of roads, all such things undertaken by the government, they come under the gross domestic fixed capital formation. So under the fixed capital formation category, there are threefold investments. One is the household residential investment. The next is the business fixed investment undertaken by the firms. The third one is the government investment, which is also called as a public expenditure. So these are the fixed expenditures undertaken by the economy. Of course, under GDKF, the next part is inventory investment. And inventory investment, all of you know that it is the change in the inventory that is accounted for, which is basically the closing stock minus opening stock. So fixed investment plus the inventory investment would give you the gross domestic capital formation, right? So while calculating the GDP MP or the NDP MP, remember that along with the fixed investment, you will have to add the inventory investment to arrive at the total capital formation that is made up by the economy. So we have the PFC, the GFC and the GDKF. which are the three major components. When external sector is involved, there is yet another small component that we will have to consider, which is the net exports. Net exports refers to the difference between export value and import payments. Exports, they refer to the supply receipts of products and services of a nation to rest of the world, or it refers to the receipt due to the exports. Imports, they are deducted from the value of export to arrive at the net export, because imports do not indicate the value of products that is domestically produced. It is deducted here, showing that the domestic population, they are buying it, but it does not represent the value of domestically produced goods. So that has to be removed to arrive at the production that happens locally and thereby supply to the rest of the world. So net exports is yet another component that is to be added over here. So on the whole, we have four major components: the private final consumption expenditure, the government final consumption expenditure, the gross domestic capital formation, and the net exports. So these are the four components of the expenditure method of calculating the national income. In the next clipping, we will see the steps involved in expenditure method of calculation of national income, and also the precautions that are to be undertaken in calculation of the same. Thank you.